You're listening to the Place Northwest COP26 podcast series,
a dedicated series that explores all things net zero carbon and sustainability within the built environment.
Alongside some of the biggest names in property, we'll be delving into topics such as
why the market is pushing net zero carbon faster than legislation.
Is renovation and retrofitting better for the planet than new construction?
How can we balance sustainability concerns with profit margins?
And much, much more.
Don't miss any future episodes. Subscribe at placenorthwest.co.uk/subscribe or wherever you get your podcasts. Hello and welcome to the Place Northwest podcast. I'm your host, Julia Hatmaker. We're continuing our COP26 series today with a look at retrofitting. In an earlier episode, we talked about how the housing sector is handling the push for retrofitting, but it's not just houses that need to be upgraded and fixed up to be made sustainable. That's why I've recruited Kate Dougherty, Head of Net Zero and Sustainability for Building Services for WSP, to chat with us. WSP is one of the world's leading engineering consulting firms. They are fervent about tackling the climate crisis, and we're the first company in the sector to commit to cutting by 50% the carbon footprint of their designs and advice by 2030. In addition to this, they will deliver net zero emissions in their own operations by 2025. So, Kate, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Julia. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so happy to have you. And I'm really excited to talk about retrofitting. It is something that I find really interesting, and I think it is so incredibly important. But I'm actually going to let you sound off on why retrofitting is so important. So if you don't mind, take it away.
Absolutely. Thank you. So, I'm sure your listeners are going to know we've got in the UK our net zero by 2050 target and 78% reduction by 2035. And on one hand, yeah, this is really, really challenging. But on the other hand, it's the absolute minimum that we've got to do to keep well below those 2 degrees warming and avoid those most devastating impacts of climate change. And it's becoming really very real now, isn't it, Julia? You know, all those things that the scientists predicted in the past, they're happening now. We've got those intense heat waves. We saw that in Europe at the beginning of the year. Just this week, we've had flash floods in London. You know, these things, they're actually already irreversible in our lifetime, and they're going to get worse. I'm sorry, this is a bit of a downer, isn't it? But you know what I'm saying is, yeah, those targets, they're just non-negotiable. So your question was, where does retrofit come into that? And again, I'm sure your listeners have heard this sort of oft quoted percentages, but it's really important because the built environment, we know that contributes around 40% of the UK's total carbon footprint. And I think in industry, we're really getting a grip of the net zero carbon new build. You know, it feels like we're getting to grips with that. But 80% of the buildings that we'll still have in 2050, they've already been built. So it's so crucial to meeting those carbon targets and tackling climate change that we focus on decarbonising our existing building stock. And you mentioned in the beginning, Julia, WSP, we were the first consultant to pledge to cut the carbon footprint of our designs in half by 2030. And in sort of getting to grips with what that actually means for us, we've realised that we know we can't actually do that without increasing the proportion of retrofit projects that we do. So I think the other thing that's kind of a really important point to make here is it's kind of a double hit when we're talking about retrofitting. So by retrofitting, we not only have the chance to make our existing energy hungry building net zero carbon, but we're also not knocking down that building and putting a new one in its place with all the vast amount of embodied carbon that comes along with that. So it's probably worth saying here, just clarifying that when we're talking about net zero carbon, we need to be very clear that this is whole life carbon operational and embodied. So we've been thinking in terms of operational carbon for quite a long time, which is just your heating, your cooling, your lighting, and everything. And that's important. But there's another sort of big piece of the puzzle, which is the embodied carbon, and that's the carbon associated with the building construction. Extracting, transporting, manufacturing all those building materials as well. So just to kind of set the scene there.
No, I think that's so important because, as you said, like operational feels very attainable, I guess, when it comes to like fixing things. You're like, oh, I'm just going to, make sure I have technology that's going to keep my house heated in a way that's sustainable. It'll be great. That's easy. Get better, heat pumps. And then when it comes to like that embodied carbon, it's like, how do you get the place that you want to build to be as least, I guess, like carbon bad as possible? And like, as you said, like retrofitting is a great solution for that. And it's breathing new life into an old space as well, which is really fantastic, I think,
Yeah,
to be honest with
absolutely.
you. So obviously we should be retrofitting. Retrofitting is a great thing. Let's get on it. But there are some challenges to retrofitting as well. I mean, I think one of the big things that we talked about a little bit earlier before the podcast was that there's no easy solution that you can just kind of implement across every single building there is.
Yeah, yeah. Do you know what it is? Is there's no one standard solution. And I think in my experience, in where we kind of are right now in this conversation, clients and design teams, in the questions they're asking, they're sort of looking for that silver bullet, that one generic solution that works for every building. But every existing building is very, very different. You've got a very different starting point, needs to be surveyed and really understood, and then a bespoke decarbonisation plan put in place. So, we're talking about commercial buildings. So, what are the heating and cooling systems in that building? How close are those systems to the end of their life? Should we be replacing them or not? How efficient is the facade? Can that be reused, or actually does it need to be much more efficient? How old's the building? What's it constructed from? How flexible is the existing structure? So lots of variables there. With a new build, you've got you've got a nice blank canvas, and you probably can apply a much more formulaic approach. But when we're talking about retrofit, you're working within much more a fixed parameters. So you've got to be much cleverer, I believe, about making the best of what you've got. The other aspect, of course, is this sort of holistic design. So everything you do impacts on everything else as well. So you can't just kind of look at these things in isolation. So how efficient your fabric is, for example, impacts on your heating loads, which impacts on the size and the suitability of the heating system you might choose. So there's lots of different variables that you need to understand and bring together.
And I do have to say, like, we talk about how there's not a silver bullet, but the downside of not having a silver bullet is it feels like costs just keep going up then because you're like, I have to have, a specially crafted design specifically for this building. I have to do this survey specifically for this one building. Like, it just seems like it seems so expensive, but that's kind of the retrofit cost, the penalty
Yeah,
of doing it, right?
yeah. Look, I mean, net zero retrofit, yeah, it does incur additional cost getting to net zero, going beyond just, refurbishing the building. And we know that it costs more to retrofit a building to meet net zero carbon than would have been the additional cost for reaching net zero on a new build in the first place. And this is particularly infuriating when we think that, all new non-domestic buildings should have been zero carbon 3 years ago if we stuck to the original sort of building regulations plan.
Yeah.
But we've got to kind of look at it a little bit differently. We've got to understand, especially in the commercial sector, that there is a cost of not retrofitting those existing assets. By not retrofitting to net zero carbon, you've got this risk of having stranded assets. In 5 or 10 years' time, it's going to be very difficult to sell or let a commercial building that is not net zero carbon. And this is driven by corporate targets of your occupiers, investor targets, and very much by occupant expectations as well. I saw a survey the other day, and Gen Z, who I think is the under 25s, I think I've got that right, 76% of them said that climate change was one of their main concerns in their life. So this is the up and coming occupants of these buildings, of these commercial offices. So there's a driver beyond just what's the cost, what's the payback. It's if we don't do this, then people are going to be left with stranded assets. I did actually see there's some research by JLL as well, which shows that more sustainable buildings can have an increased rental value. And I think it was 6 to 10 or 6 to 11% in terms of the increased rental value. So that needs to be taken into account as well. And we know with all of these things, as the supply chain grows and as we're doing this more and more, economies of scale can bring the costs down. And the oft quoted sort of example of that is photovoltaics, which we know have come down about 80% in cost in the last 10 years. So it's more than just looking at the additional cost in isolation. There's a much bigger picture here in terms of value, I think.
Yeah. But I do think, like, too, you do need to factor in that it is just going to cost more and just, add that, be realistic about what comes with this. Because I know we talked a little bit before about, the same issues that are impacting new buildings, like the supply chain, materials, being more expensive. Like, that's still going to apply to a retrofit. And that is just, again, it's the cost we all live with to do business at this point. Let's say there's all these things I want to do to retrofit my building, and I've probably picked up some like things like triple glazing's one of them and things like that. Is there anything that might on the outset seem like a really great idea, but maybe like on second glance is like actually like this is probably not the best thing for you to do, or may not be the best thing for you to do that you can think of?
Yeah, for sure. And I think this brings us back to this conversation around whole life carbon and kind of and the bespoke solutions and the nuance within that, because when looking at that whole life carbon balance of operational carbon and embodied carbon, this is now a different way of thinking about how we do things, perhaps different to how we approach things traditionally when we only really had this focus on operational. So we actually did an analysis on a office building project quite recently. This was a retrofit of a sort of 5-story office building. And the question was, is it worth replacing the facade to go to triple glazing for this project? And the answer was no, because the embodied carbon of that triple glazing over the lifetime of the building actually significantly exceeded the carbon savings that we'd get from the reduced heat loads in the
Wow.
building. Yeah, I know. So it's different. It used to be like, oh yeah, triple glazing, go to, but it's not when you're looking a whole life, at whole life carbon. It's not necessarily the case. I've seen similar analysis on solar panels, for example. That's a bit more complex and it's different for every building type. But I have seen analysis on certain buildings where solar panels didn't necessarily pay back from a whole life carbon perspective. So yeah, for sure, it's really important to start thinking in this very different way about the whole life cycle of the carbon emissions of the building.
Yeah, you weren't joking about there not being a silver bullet. You've taken away my solar panels, and now you're telling me triple glazing may not be great. But
They can work in some instances, but the whole point is that every project and every building is different. We need to do those calculations to properly understand it instead of just applying broad brush sort of solutions to everything.
yeah, it's like being
Yeah,
smarter, like working smarter, not harder, basically,
yeah,
with it.
yeah.
I feel like another key problem with retrofitting, it's not even like so much of a problem, it's more of a challenge that we face when we retrofit is like it sounds like there's some education we need to do to get everyone in the loop on the best ways to retrofit things. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think within certainly within our industry, that's absolutely, that's happening for sure. There's a whole lot of guidance and a whole lot of collaboration out there on what that really means at the design end of the industry. But I think there's also probably certainly where we really need to catch up is more around the supply chain and the skills and knowledge there. To meet these net zero targets, there's a really wide scale retrofit program required, and I'm talking almost beyond just offices and commercial now. It's a massive piece of work to be done, and there isn't yet sufficient knowledge and skills in the supply chain to deliver that low or zero carbon retrofit on that scale. So builders to retrofit to high fabric standards, the people trained to install and maintain heat pumps. There's also a lot of research to be done around understanding the embodied carbon of things like building services. We understand quite well now the structure of a building, but things like building services, those HVAC systems, there's some more understanding, research and knowledge that needs to be gained there. And the answer to that, of course, is sort of policy changes and a secure pipeline of work from the public sector to provide that clear direction and give industry the confidence it needs to invest in that upskilling. But I'm definitely hearing from where I operate in the industry, I'm hearing a lot of conversation about this at the moment. So that's really that's really exciting.
So, okay, we've kind of covered some of the big challenges that face you when you want to retrofit a building. Let's get in. Let's lift people back up. We set them down with that whole climate change is happening. So now we're gonna lift you guys back up here. So what are some of the opportunities that retrofitting represents?
For sure. Do you know what? I think in and of itself, retrofitting is a huge opportunity. It is one thing that can have an absolutely massive impact on our sort of route to net zero carbon. Ultimately, if we can nail net zero retrofit, then we've made a huge leap forward on those net zero carbon goals. And it's one of the steps to net zero carbon that it's technically possible right now with existing technology. We're not waiting for new things to come online to solve this problem. So it is technically possible. It's just about getting everyone on board with that. I think a sort of almost more specific technical opportunity that I love to talk about is the opportunity with some of the, if you go back far enough, giving old buildings a new life. So if you go back far enough, there were old buildings that were designed and constructed in an inherently sustainable, passive, efficient way. I'm thinking of an example of an office project in Manchester that I've recently worked on. It was half retrofit of what was originally a gorgeous, large Georgian home, and half a new build office, sort of built on the back and connected to it. So the retrofit of that Georgian building gave us so much opportunity to reinstate the original energy efficient design intent. It had these wonderful tall windows that flooded the place with natural light. They'd actually been painted shut for years, and we were able to look at opening those up and taking out internal partitions to enable the original natural ventilation to flow through the building again. There were gorgeous high ceilings, the kind of floor to ceiling height that we would never comprehend using today in an office, for cost reasons. And it's got a thermally massive structure that, together with those high ceilings, help to regulate the internal temperatures. But what was really wonderful about that project was that the design of the old element, the reinstatement of the passive design of the old element, it actually also followed through and drove the design of the new element attached to it, by necessity, really. So those wonderful high floor to ceiling heights of the existing building, they had to follow through to the new building, the same as the natural ventilation approach, and the natural light. It all followed through the design, and the old influenced the new. And this one, it was actually one of the lowest energy use intensity buildings that I've worked on today, and it didn't necessarily set out to be that. It was just the fact that we sort of used the the inherent passive design of the old building, and that influenced everything else, and created a really nice internal environment as well. So I really enjoyed that one.
I think the thing I love so much about that story is I feel like it's very tempting for us, in 2021 to look at back on people in the past and be like, "Oh, they didn't quite know what they were doing." Like, they were, I guess, like less smart about things. They just didn't have technology and they didn't have the know-how, that kind of jazz. And like this is a case where it's like actually they knew what they were doing. They were doing really good stuff with these buildings. There's
Yeah,
things we can learn from and how this building is made and implement in the world today and make better buildings.
for sure. So much of sustainable design is not about adding more technology and more stuff to do the job. It's actually about trying to be more efficient, more lean, taking things out of the design, making it operate passively and naturally, and having just less material, so less embodied carbon. So definitely looking to the past can give us inspiration for future designs.
Yeah, and I know we talked too about how public opinion is just heading in the retrofit direction. You can't really ignore it at this point. People want to be in green buildings. You've got to make a building that's green. The end,
Yeah.
basically.
For sure, for sure. I mean, we spoke earlier about, I think we spoke about corporate targets, investor
Hmm.
targets, occupant expectations, Gen Z, all of these things. Just last week, there was an article on the news, sort of prime time news, BBC, a report from the Royal Academy of Engineering it was about, and the headline was "Construction Companies Told to Stop Knocking Down Buildings," and this sort of made it into the headlines, and I thought, brilliant. There really is an opportunity here for this different way of thinking, and it's starting to seep into the consciousness, not just of the industry, but of the understanding and of the public. So, can we start to replace this sort of fashion or desire for shiny new glass offices as corporate status symbols, with actually the new status symbol being an older building brought back to life as a premium net zero carbon office? We've got a quite good example actually recently, of a stunning commercial retrofit project in London. It was completed a couple of years back, but it was BREEAM excellent, very high levels of energy efficiency. The tenants could sort of track their own energy consumption via an app. It was full of natural light from an atrium, and all of this was achieved in a retrofit. It
Wow.
was premium. Um, it wasn't second best to a shiny new building. It was a stunning, desirable office, and it actually won an award for the best office development at the UK Property Awards. So it's not that it can happen. It's not playing second fiddle to shiny new buildings.
Yeah. And I feel like one of the things that's really come across in this conversation, though, is just the need for this to be much more than just one industry working on it. It needs to be kind of, a huge community effort. And part of that means that the public sector has to chip in and help make it happen. So what can be done on a government level to help push for retrofit?
Yeah, for sure. This is so important for like all those reasons we spoke about: supply chain confidence, and just sort of getting this moving. I mean, there's some things already that are driving positive change. We've got the MEES, which is the minimum energy efficiency standards. So we know that by 2030 you won't be able to let a property, a commercial property with an EPC worse than B. That's an energy performance certificate, worse than B. And the consultation for that actually states that yes, it's an ambitious target, but one of its specific aims is encouraging investment in the fabric and the services of rented non-domestic buildings, and we're actually seeing that have an impact. I've recently read an article that the investment bank Jefferies actually downgraded the rating of British Land and Land Securities because 70% of their portfolio fell below an energy performance certificate of B. And the calculation that Jefferies had done was that it would cost like 700 or 800 million each for these companies to resolve that prior to 2030. So you can see that sort of governmental level policy driving, driving change in the market for sure. I think another really important part of this what can government do question is regulating embodied carbon. Now, this actually kind of directly impacts new builds, but any focus on reducing embodied carbon then has a knock-on impact to incentivizing retrofit for sure. So what I'm talking about here is the construction industry has come together to actually propose an amendment to the building regulations, and that amendment is known as Part Z. So our current Part L of the building regs, which is for minimizing carbon emissions, that actually only covers operational carbon. And as we've already talked about loads, that is just half of the story. You'd need to cover embodied carbon as well. So Part Z proposes this requirement to assess whole life carbon emissions and a limiting of embodied carbon emissions for all major building projects. This isn't this isn't building regs at the moment. This is the industry coming together and saying, we think we need this particular building regulation because embodied carbon is the elephant in the room at the minute, and it's such an important piece of the journey to net zero. And how this impacts with retrofit is, I believe that if embodied carbon was strictly regulated, then that really puts this focus on the embodied carbon hierarchy, which is build nothing, build less, build clever, build efficiently, which obviously the build nothing and the build less is about retrofit and refurbishment. I think there's a piece for planning authorities to play as well. I've heard an idea that I've heard proposed is that planning authorities could perhaps have like budgets or quotas to limit the amount of embodied carbon that they can grant permission for in any given period. So this would be a really strong incentive for net zero carbon schemes as a whole, but also a really strong incentive for retrofit. And we've already spoken about how important it is for public sector to lead the way in terms of driving the broader industry towards net zero carbon and demonstrating leadership. Because when you think about it, with public buildings, health and education estates, social housing, there's a massive long-term pipeline of work that requires green retrofit there. So there's a real opportunity to use public sector buildings to give the supply chain the confidence it needs to invest in those staff and those skills and the technology required and build that up.
Yeah, and it strikes me like what's important is that the government needs to not only offer, as we talked about, punishments, I guess, to not retrofitting, but it also has to offer like that solutions, like you're saying, it has to offer, help give the
Yeah,
confidence, and in some cases, give some of the funds to make this doable. You kind of have to do both,
yeah,
carrot and stick.
yeah, absolutely.
All right. So, given all of this and what we just talked about, how do you personally feel about where the UK stands in terms of the retrofit situation and meeting our net zero goals? Are you optimistic? Are you not? Is there
Right.
hope?
Of course, of course. Look, I've said we've got the technology, we've got the skills. The great thing is that in the built environment, much more so than other industries like aviation or shipping, we've actually got a lot of the answers. We've got what we need to get to net zero carbon now. But I suppose the real challenge when we're talking about retrofit is it's the sheer scale of what needs to be achieved in a relatively short time frame. A huge industry needs to grow up around this problem to deliver it, and for that to happen, we need all the things that we've already spoken about in terms of the supply chain and scaling up, etc. It very much starts with those interventions that we spoke about from government and the public sector, but if we've got that, then yes, we totally can do it. And there is plenty of hopeful signs out there that I'm seeing. There's various campaigns that the industry's come together on. There's the Architects Journal Retrofit First campaign, for example. We're talking about COP26. It's great to see that COP26 actually has a whole day dedicated to the built environment for the first time, and retrofit will absolutely be a big part of what's discussed at that. And this is all, it's definitely really playing out in my experience on the ground with clients as well. Just last week, I was talking to a developer of a city centre office block, and they were telling me that the first step in their process had actually been a review of the existing building on their site and an assessment of the possibility of retrofitting that building or perhaps reusing some of the existing structure. So yeah, look, it's a big job, but it's absolutely possible. We've got to be optimistic, don't we? And I think, like every other aspect of this race to net zero carbon that we're in, we need to move away from thinking of this as a cost, and we really need to reframe this as the huge opportunity that it is. The opportunity to create green jobs, unlock sustainable economic growth, and specifically in our industry, provide those much higher quality buildings for people to live and work in.
Kate, I normally end these by recapping it, but I think you kind of just nailed it right there. I mean, we've got to retrofit. There are challenges, but we're going to overcome them. We have to
Yeah,
overcome
we
them,
are.
and we're going to make it work. Like that.
Yeah, yeah,
That's the podcast today. That was it. Oh, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate this, and I really enjoyed our discussion. I thought it was really interesting and really informative, so thank you.
No, thank you, Julia. It's been great fun.
If you want to learn more about sustainability and the built environment, you should check out our COP26 series. This is just one of those episodes. We have a whole slew of them, and there'll be more coming out over the next few weeks as well. So don't miss a single episode. And the best way to make sure that you are up to date on all things COP26 Place Podcast series stuff is to make sure you are subscribing to Place Podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. And if you enjoy the podcast, I'm just going to keep saying how many times I can say podcast today, please consider leaving us a review. It helps people find the show, and it gives us really good feedback so we know how we can make a better podcast for you. So with that, I'm going to stop saying the word podcast. I'm Julia Hatmaker. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.